Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the faculties, distinguished friends from the diplomatic community, ladies and gentlemen. When I was invited to inaugurate the Rih Hwa Leadership in Asia lectures, I could not decline. When my foreign minister was casting around for a man capable of being our ambassador in Bangkok, Rih Hwa took up the appointment. He discharged it from 1967 to 1971, refusing to accept any remuneration. He went on to serve from 1972 to 1974 as our ambassador in Brussels, also accredited to the EEC, to Bonn, and was our permanent representative in Geneva, again without any salary. In 1962, we awarded him the Meritorious Service Medal. Rih Hwa was born in Singapore in 1917, the son of a Chinese immigrant. You have heard the brief history of the man from his son. I think I'd save you the repetition if I went on to describe the latter part of his life. He was educated at Zheng School from primary 1 to primary 5. At the age of 11, he was sent to China to continue his education and graduated with a BA from Nanking University. In 1944, he left China and studied agricultural economics at Cornell, USA, where he met and married Lien Fung, a fellow Cornell graduate student from Hunan. After his studies, his father-in-law, a wealthy and successful entrepreneur, sent him to Thailand and Burma to work for Taiwan, the father-in-law's company. He bought tungsten and tin for Huachang, the parent company of Taiwan. He knew nothing about business and received constant and detailed instructions from his father-in-law. He also learned how to deal in agricultural products like seed lac and jute. I don't know what seed lac is. But on his own, he mastered the trading and production of tapioca, flour, and chips and became one of the largest producers of tapioca in Thailand. He and his wife, a chemist, started a factory to make glass noodles from mung beans, modernizing the process and forcing others to follow suit. Then he went on to flour milling, jute sorting and trading, a vegetable oil factory, and an electroplating plant. He did not start as an entrepreneur. He was more a trusted manager receiving guidance from an entrepreneur, his father-in-law. But he later branched out on his own and became a successful entrepreneur. His development from a manager to an entrepreneur holds out promise to many who start off as managers. Entrepreneurship has been described by the Center for Entrepreneurship at Babson College in Massachusetts, which I'm told is one of the major centers in the world, as, and I quote this, a way of thinking and acting that is opportunity-obsessed, holistic in approach, and leadership balanced. That's very concise. I'm not quite sure I've grasped the full significance of it. It is identifying an opportunity regardless of the sources currently available and executing on that opportunity for the purpose of wealth creation in the private, public, and global sectors. In other words, an entrepreneur, if I can put it in my words, sees, evaluates, exploits opportunities, whereas a manager concentrates on the effective use of available resources to achieve optimum results. I believe that entrepreneurs are born, and I was confirmed in this belief through many life experiences, that before you are able to excel in a particular field, the necessary qualities had to be innate. I choose an example with dogs because it's less sensitive than talking about humans. I was once presented with a beautiful Labrador retriever. I sent the dog to the police training school to get it to sit, lie down, heel to command. He was not successful because he was a show dog, a champion show dog. Later, I read of a Labrador retriever in the Guardian newspaper, a British newspaper, that could catch trout and retrieve peasants shot by his master. And the dog belonged to the Hume family in Scotland. After a fortuitous conversation with Sir Alec Douglas Hume in 1971, he presented my daughter with a bitch. He came out here with an RAF VC-10, and the bitch came with him. It was bred from a line of field trial champions, and the pedigree was that long, 14 generations back. Teaching her to obey all the commands was effortless. And had I the birds for her to retrieve after the fish I'd caught in the pond, she would have no trouble doing it and biting it and bringing it back without damaging either the peasant or fish. In fact, she became so bored with the routine repeat of the same commands that on the first command, she would go through the whole repertoire. I'm not an entrepreneur, but I can recognize one. I've been engaged in political leadership. I believe is similar to the question, are leaders born or trained? A person not born with leadership qualities cannot improve significantly, however thorough the training. Those with some leadership qualities can, with training, become somewhat better leaders than they would otherwise have been. Now, if you look at the British, they used to make the great discoveries: steam engines, textile machines, electric motors. They won many Nobel Prizes for science. However, they did not commercialize their discoveries, or as the writer on entrepreneurship put it in this book I read, they did not turn their inventions into profitable goods or services that people would buy. So I asked myself, why this lack of capacity to commercialize their innovations? I believe it is because of their culture. Long years of empire, over 2 centuries, they developed a society where old wealth and the landed gentry were held in high esteem. The new rich were regarded with some disdain. The bright aspired to be successful and admired for their intellectual skills as lawyers, doctors, professionals, people who used their brains and had clean hands, not engineers or people who work hard and had to dirty their hands. They played with words. Their values were shaped by the attitudes of old wealth and the landed gentry. New rich were not embraced in the upper reaches of society, but their children could aspire to be welcome after going through the necessary public schools and universities, and their new wealth matured and they became old rich. Eventually, in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher set out to change the fundamental values and attitudes of the British people towards old and new wealth. She privatized and nationalized industries and encouraged private enterprise. Like most of her generation, she did not consider profit a dirty word. The results proved convincingly that the same companies, when run by persons appointed and answerable to majority shareholders, were more profitable than they were when run by boards of statutory corporations. The difference between British and American values cannot be more profound. The United States is a frontier society. By and large, there were and are no class barriers. Everybody celebrated getting rich. Hence the Enron case, until they were discovered. Everybody wanted to be rich and tried to be. As a great urge to start new enterprises and create wealth, the US has been the most dynamic society in innovating and starting up companies to commercialize new discoveries or inventions, thus creating new wealth. American society is always on the move and changing. They have led the world in patents, striving to produce something new or do something better, faster, cheaper, increasing productivity. Having created a product that sold well in America, they then market it worldwide. The Economist of February 1999, in a profile of an elderly Japanese entrepreneur, noted, after talking to him, self-made men attract ridicule and condescension in snooty Japan. These were also the social attitudes of the British upper class before Margaret Thatcher challenged and set out to change them. When I saw America's amazing recovery in the last 10 years of the last century, after it lost much ground to industries in Japan and Germany, I appreciated the full meaning of the Americans being entrepreneurial. But for every successful entrepreneur in America, many have tried and failed. Quite a few tried repeatedly until they succeeded. Quite a few succeeded and continued to create and start up new companies as serial entrepreneurs. This was the way America's great companies were built. This is the spirit that generates a dynamic economy. Now, Chinese culture and values. They have determined the aspirations of generations of their bright students. Ever since the spring-autumn period, that's about 770 to 403 BC, traditional Chinese societies have valued first the scholar, shi, second, the farmer, nong, third, the worker, gong, and fourth and last, the merchant, shang. This is the social hierarchy of an agricultural society and has not changed much in popular culture. The merchant class did not enjoy high social status in most agricultural societies, not only because their economic role was not obvious, because they were always making on the percentage, but also because it was often considered unproductive. Traditional China under the Confucian order was a highly developed society based on a self-sufficient agrarian economy, not open or willing to embrace changes. Such a society did not spark off the Industrial Revolution, nor give rise to capitalism. For generations, bright young Chinese chose the path of scholarship, and through the imperial examination system became Mandarins. The same values prevailed in Japan and Korea, both influenced by Confucian culture. Even in present-day China, Japan and Korea, many of the best graduates of their top universities go for a job in government rather than join a private company or start business on their own. And so this has been in Singapore. The result, these countries have not had a strong entrepreneurial tradition. With the British, most of the best Oxbridge graduates competed for places in the civil service until the late 1980s, when the Big Bang, the liberalization of London, led to huge rewards in the financial services in the city of London. And then they drew in talent. With the Americans, it's different. It's always been the opposite. The best graduates go into business or join the big corporations, not the government. Recently, I read a circular from the Kennedy School where I was asked to speak some 2 years ago. And the new president asked the dean, "Why are your graduates not joining government? What is your contribution?" And the dean replied, "Oh, it's much improved since September the 11th. My early belief that entrepreneurs were born, not made, was modified by my experience. For years, I've been comparing the difference between Hong Kong and Singapore businessmen. The lessons I drew are both encouraging and sobering. With the communist liberation of the mainland, Hong Kong received an influx of ready-made entrepreneurs, manufacturers, bankers, shipping operators, and traders from the coastal cities like Shanghai, Xiamen, Shantou, and Guangzhou. They built the manufacturing industry in Hong Kong, starting with textiles and plastics, toys, and businesses like shipping and banking. They were experienced entrepreneurs, and they spawned an entrepreneurial culture among the other displaced people who flooded into Hong Kong from China. One Hong Kong manufacturer settled here became a Singapore citizen. Over lunch, he recounted to me that when he employed Singaporeans to work for him, this was about 10 years ago, they were still working for him as senior managers, completely trustworthy and efficient. But the managers he brought from Hong Kong had left him to start garment businesses of their own to compete with him. They saw what he was doing, and they did likewise. I had to change my mind. There was such a thing called an entrepreneurial culture in a society that encouraged many to try to succeed in business. I've also studied how Taiwan benefited from some entrepreneurs who had come from the mainland. But by and large, the mainlanders in Taiwan controlled the bureaucracy and the military. This left the native Taiwanese in agriculture, trading, and manufacturing. And they were the entrepreneurs who started the many small and medium enterprises that became the striking feature of Taiwan's economic dynamism. The big state-owned enterprises that needed massive investments for steel and shipbuilding and petrochemicals were run by the mainlanders. Hence, it is not surprising that Singapore did not have a strong entrepreneurial tradition. Our businessmen were mostly traders and shopkeepers with no experience of investing in factories that required long gestation periods and large capital expenditure before they could break even and eventually become profitable. Singapore banks were not keen to advance money to such traders to start factories. Our bankers did not have the experience or the expertise to make such risk assessments and to manage such risks. So when we had to industrialize to solve our high unemployment, we were compelled to start the Development Bank of Singapore, DBS, to undertake the risks of lending to new manufacturing ventures. And this was how GLCs, or government-linked companies, came about, because we did not have enough entrepreneurs. And those we had lacked the capital or interest. And government ministers undertook the task of starting these new ventures. I had a number of highly successful entrepreneurial ministers, Goh Keng Swee, Hon Sui Sen, Lim Kim San. They launched new enterprises. Goh started a shipping line with government officers and a Pakistani shipping expert to guide them. A Pakistani shipping expert. I did not know then that we would leave the Pakistanis behind in the shipping business. NOL eventually succeeded. When Malaysia and Singapore Airlines was broken up, we started Singapore Airlines, headed by some outstanding civil servants. So too National Iron and Steel, Chartered Industries, Keppel, Sembawang, Jurong shipyards. Besides several enterprises in food processing. We did it out of necessity, and we did not consider it unusual that government ministers acted as entrepreneurs, selecting the most promising and energetic of our officers to run these new companies. We succeeded. We were fighting to survive. Ministers and civil senior officers were highly motivated, with no thought of financial reward. We also had, every year, collected the best students from the schools on scholarships to the universities, and then they came back. All of us were acutely aware that if we failed, the people would suffer unemployment and degradation of their lives. Every one of those officers who took charge of our enterprises went all out to make their companies succeed, which meant to make them profitable. With growing stability and economic well-being, and with a passage of 3 or more decades, that mood, do or die, has passed with a new generation. We recognize this. So now we need to motivate those who manage these GLCs by more conventional methods, rewarding them in accordance with profits they make, including stock options, so that if they win, the company wins, they will get more. The dream of wealth attracts everyone. But it is those who innovate in creating new products and services who will be the new rich. Few are born entrepreneurs, and not many will succeed. To succeed as a successful entrepreneur, one has to have some extraordinary qualities: high energy levels, a cut of mind that sees opportunities where others see problems, and a keen sense of what product or service will be profitable. The Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, or GEM, in 2001, in an executive report, made this specific point, that the small size of Singapore's domestic market and the general weakness in the economies of the region have made it more difficult for startups to grow without exporting. Those seeking funding, therefore, have to demonstrate an ability to penetrate global markets. The report found that Singapore had the 3rd lowest rate of entrepreneurial activity among the GEM 2001 countries, just 5.2%, just above Japan, 5.1%, and Belgium, 4.6%. But Singapore's rate of 5.2% compares poorly against 11.7% for the United States. Despite these obstacles, we have had some successful Singaporean entrepreneurs. The more well-known amongst them, you know, Sim Bon Woo of creative technology, Wong Nit Leong of venture manufacturing, and Kwek Ling Beng of Hong Leong Group. Their experience and that of other emerging ones should be researched to discover the attributes they share in common and whether they confirm the findings of GEM. of what makes an entrepreneur. I believe circumstances and culture decides how entrepreneurial a people or a group or subgroup of them become. In Indonesia and Malaysia, the Chinese are by and large excluded from the bureaucracy and the armed forces. So the energetic and resourceful Chinese have become successful businessmen and entrepreneurs. In Singapore, many of those who are most likely to succeed have been inducted into politics, the bureaucracy, the Army, Navy, and Air Force. Hence, too few are in business on their own, and even fewer are entrepreneurs. However, Singaporeans can slowly change with changing circumstances. Our values and culture are not as deeply embedded because we are a young society of immigrant stock. Nevertheless, it will take time and effort to change them through education. There is an obverse side to a dynamic entrepreneurial economy. The same GEM study found that in Denmark and Finland in the early 1990s, the total income controlled by the wealthiest 20% of the population divided by the total income controlled by the poorest 20% was 3.6. In other words, a fairly egalitarian society. In the United States, it was 9.4. 3.6 against 9.4. So to change our values, we must consciously focus on new specific values we have to adopt. And there are 4 salient features of American entrepreneurial culture. First, a national emphasis on personal independence and self-reliance. Americans do many things for themselves. 2, respect for those starting new businesses. 3, acceptance of failure in entrepreneurial and innovation efforts. 4, tolerance for a high degree of income disparity. For over 30 years, we in Singapore have aimed for an egalitarian society. If we want to have more successful entrepreneurs, Singaporeans must accept a greater income disparity between the successful and the not so successful. Let me wind up and recapitulate the significance of what I've tried to convey. Singapore had to remake itself when it became independent in 1965. The Cold War was on. China was isolated out of the world's markets. Most developing countries chose import substitution and rejected MNCs. They believed MNCs would exploit their labor and natural resources. We therefore had the whole export-oriented freeway open to us, and we succeeded. The Cold War now is over. The enemy is not communism, but terrorism. The terrorist war looks set to be the backdrop for some time. We're in for a new era of the global economy. China will be a vacuum cleaner for foreign direct investments, and its production capacity is enormous. But we must get our part of FDIs in higher value added and higher technology sectors. Our own domestic conditions have changed. The easy things we have done. We've become a manufacturing base, financial services center, a transportation hub. We've rebuilt our city center and rehoused the whole population. Now we need imaginative and artistic architects and planners, city planners, to create living space with enough greenery and leisure areas. We've educated everyone. Today, nearly all Singaporeans go through secondary education. After secondary school, 20% on to universities, 40% to polytechnics, and 20% to institutes of technical education. But now comes the difficult part, to raise their quality at each level so that they can, through better training and higher productivity, meet the competition from lower wage workers in China. More of our firms must expand regionally. Not everyone has to start a business from scratch. More would succeed by building on old businesses and expanding internationally. Some of our energetic and resourceful and able people must go into business and not stay in salaried jobs. This is a change of culture, of values, of mindset. It will not be easy, but some can succeed. We need a more supportive and conducive environment that will encourage enterprise. A new generation of emerging entrepreneurs such as Ong Peng Sin of Interwoven and Olivia Lam of Hyflux, they are starting up companies, branching out in successful new directions, applying technology to capture new opportunities. Those in the professions and corporations also must have an entrepreneurial outlook, able and willing to take their professional services or companies in new directions. Being entrepreneurial does not mean only starting big new companies. Every new business, however small, that fills a need is an enterprise that adds to our dynamism. The government intends to release more of its able and resourceful officers to the private sector after they have served their scholarship bonds. However, that may not mean we will have more entrepreneurs if they don't change their mindsets. We have a much smaller market than Hong Kong or Taiwan, and that is all the more reason why we have to match or better their tax regime. They keep direct taxes low. To conclude, the remaking of Singapore does not mean we throw out every strength and virtue we have developed. We did not do everything wrong, or we will not be what we are today. The present generation of leaders must build on what we have achieved and preserve that cohesive society, a better educated and skilled people, harmonious industrial relations, and a determined quest for excellence. Innovation and enterprise are only part of what we should have more of. We need to keep our industrial sector vibrant through high-tech and high-value-added investments from MNCs. We must improve our internationally traded services sector by adding medical, educational, and legal services, attracting customers from the immediate region and beyond, from India and China. The world has changed, and so must we. Thank you.